Welcome to Casey Cares. We're the voice of Kansas City nonprofits, and we share the stories of local nonprofits and enhance the quality of life right here in Kansas City for our residents and our visitors. This Casey Cares segment is brought to you by the Ewing, Mary, and Kaufman Foundation, www.kaufman.org. I'm Ruth Baum-Biggis. When professional leadership of a nonprofit changes, no matter the reason, lay leaders are suddenly faced with a big question. Who's going to run the organization day to day? Often boards decide to buy some time by appointing an interim CEO or executive director. But how do you know when an interim is the right move? What skills should that person bring to the table? And how do you find someone who's the right fit, even knowing that the role is probably temporary? We wanted some real world answers around this interim leadership solution conversation. So we turned to someone who knows this work inside and out. Our guest has served as an interim CEO and now helps connect and coach others who are hoping to land that nonprofit C-suite job. Joining us is Awais Sufi. He is the managing partner of Yield Creative, a consulting platform that provides strategic guidance to foundations, social ventures, and private companies as they build new pathways or navigate complex challenges. Awais, welcome.
So good to be with you, Ruth. Thanks for having me today, and just delighted to have a conversation with you about something I feel very passionate about. So thank you again.
Well, in full disclosure for our audience, Awais and I actually worked together. He was in an interim position for a nonprofit here in Kansas City. So we know each other a little bit. It's not just totally a cold conversation, as it were. And in fact, you recently just finished another interim position.
Yeah, that's right. One of the things that happens when you do the interim CEO roles is that you're all in for a while, and then all of a sudden, with some success, you've been able to help an organization navigate and shift, toward that next path for it. But that's kind of when you take the off ramp, and you need to find another one of these journeys, another mountain to climb. And yeah, I was very fortunate to engage with another wonderful group out in the Northland of Kansas City. And as I did that, that too just actually came to a close in the last month or so, a little less than a month ago. And yeah, so now I'm waiting for that next mountain to present itself.
Well, if you would share a little bit of your background so folks know where you're coming from, and then we'll talk about how you got into this work.
Sure. Yeah. Well, so, the way back background is my roots are in Topeka. I grew up in Topeka, but left right after high school. I was a graduate of the University of Chicago, then then I became a lawyer. I went to the University of Texas at Austin and actually practiced corporate and securities law, and actually clerked for a judge for 5 or 6 years early in my career. So I kind of bring that to the table as a kind of a lawyer that has had the opportunity to engage in pretty rigorous legal practice. And as I was doing my kind of core corporate practice, I actually, just given my own passion about social ventures, social justice, those types of efforts, I started to consult with and advise, initially as legal counsel, a whole series of nonprofits, and about their charitable, exemptions, about kind of the rules of the road. And what's interesting is that then in turn translated into kind of giving advice, perspective on how they might think about their operations and what that might look like as they try to build and grow their impact. And all of that ultimately led me to understand, or kind of in self-reflection, that as much as I liked being a lawyer and the rigors of law practice, my true path was going to be to actually jump into leadership of nonprofit organizations. And I ended up leaving my Washington, D.C. law practice to join a client of the firm, a gentleman that was starting up a nonprofit social venture. And that was around workforce development, training, education of youth internationally, actually. He was really passionate about that. And I helped him build and grow that effort, which was called the Education for Employment Foundation. and then ultimately left him to join a larger nonprofit organization called the International Youth Foundation, which worked in about 50 countries around the world. And what that gave me was this amazing opportunity to engage with youth serving organizations globally. And seeing all sorts of typologies, patterns, approaches, the types of things that different organizations were doing, and honestly, complex situations. When you had a crisis at hand, whether it be because of financial issues, a human resource issue, whether it be because of a leadership transition, board issues, whatever those things might be, they presented themselves when you have 50 different countries to sort of percolate in your domain, and you're supporting different entities in that kind of a way. That kind of really led me to want to lead, my own nonprofit. And I had this wonderful opportunity. Loved the international work, but honestly, the international travel was just killing me. So I said, well, maybe it was time to start looking at issues closer to home. And I was very fortunately recruited by actually one of your core sponsor, the Ewing Marion Kauffman Foundation, to come in to jump in and help them build a collaborative fund to support school improvement in Kansas City. And that work was ultimately built out into an organization that I founded and led for about 8 years called School Smart Kansas City, which I feel enormously proud of and continues to run to this day. I supported now my successor, who was my deputy, in terms of taking on the role as the CEO. And again, just really cemented my understanding and thinking about the importance of leadership, the importance of positioning organizations for leadership, and how I might have some skills in that regard. And so when I ended up about 3 years ago starting to consult, both with my executive coaching certification, which I'd gotten along the way, and then providing strategic consulting support to different nonprofit organizations, as well as some for-profits as well. One of the things that started coming my way were these interim chief executive officer roles that we've started to talk about. It's really been kind of a joy to do that work, and it's been a significant part of my consulting practice since I started out.
You have a wide range of experiences, that's for sure. How has that assisted you in what you're doing today as a consultant for nonprofits in this leadership space?
Yeah, that's it's an important question. I reflect on it regularly. I mean, I think, foundationally, I will say the fact that, I am a lawyer by trade, at least, has been very helpful to me. It meant that I was engaging with, boards of directors, governance structures, from a very early time in my career. I understood, the rules of the road with respect to how those, entities operate. You don't need to be a lawyer to be clear for this kind of work, but I will say, as you asked the question, it is something I've reflected on. I think it's been helpful to me. Another area that was really important to me early on was I I've had the great fortune of working with either philanthropies or philanthropic intermediaries, basically groups that are giving out grants. And as they give out grants, one of the things that's really important is that you need to do your due diligence on organizations. So, what does it look like to really assess from soup to nuts how an organization is both functioning programmatically, but also financially. And one of the things that I found very early on, to say another element of this, is the financial side. I just, it's funny, I didn't ever go into anything math or science related in my own, career path. But I think I just have a natural, affinity for numbers, and to go into the financial statements to understand how it is that the financials are translating into activities. And if you really dig into those numbers, you start getting a pretty good sense of where the organization is going, either very positively or into a challenging position. So, whether it be the legal side, whether it be the, operational due diligence side, whether it be the financial side, all of those are kind of different experience and skills that I brought in early. And then I'll say finally, one of the key roles I had very early on too, and persists to this day, was revenue development. So when you're into, the idea of how do we cultivate new supporters of this work that we feel really passionate about, um, you know, you begin to understand, just the core driving force of what an organization is trying to accomplish, and why they're trying to accomplish it and what brings people to the table around that. And if you do that well and you understand that well, the sky's the limit in terms of supporting the organization to get to that next level. So there's a lot of different pieces of it, but, kind of rounds it out into something that, again, just puts me in the position of loving working with these kinds of groups and helping kind of reset, restart, and, refresh where the future is for them.
Well, as I had mentioned in the introduction, trying to fill that leadership void, no matter how that has occurred, doesn't matter how it's occurred. For example, if an organization loses its top leader, CEO, executive director because of, inappropriate behavior or mismanagement of funds versus someone retires and the organization is looking, does it matter how then you look for an interim or what should be considered?
Yeah, it very much does. I mean, I wish there was a science to this because I would say it's probably more art than science here, but I'll, try to give at least some contours what I've seen. I mean, I think I would kind of say that these interim roles fall into two categories. One is, I would say, kind of a temporary fix for just to, that there's nobody internally at the organization that can take the helm during a transition time that's, maybe unexpected, but not for necessarily any real fundamental challenging issues. So, for example, like you said, somebody might be retiring. They decided they wanted to retire a little early, or maybe there's a health issue of a reasonably strong functioning organization. And, the challenge being that the C-suite, for whatever reason, there isn't the right position, there isn't the right person to sort of step in easily to take on that role. And so typically, there's going to be a CEO search and it's going to commence rapidly. But that's, there's going to be 2, 3, 4 months of time between the current leadership transition and the new CEO coming in. And they just really need somebody to, to take the steering wheel and just make sure that, you're just following, the path in an appropriate way. Candidly, those are a little, at least from my perspective, a little less likely to be found, just because they're so happenstance. And then secondly, they are shorter term and, at least from a business perspective for somebody that's looking at doing this type of work, anything can be considered, but it's just not. One of the challenges with the interim CEO work is that when you do it, you have to be all in. And so you've got to be conscious of the fact that by taking that opportunity, it's a short-term one that you're all in, you're going to actually allow your own business development efforts to atrophy without much sort of longevity, right? So you're like, oh, I'm just going to stop and I'm going to start doing this really hard. And then it's like, all of a sudden it's done, which, by the way, in the second type of group that I'm going to mention is also happens, but those ones are a little bit longer term. So at least you get the benefit of a longer term engagement just from a business perspective that, allows you to continue to function. So that's the first category. The second category I would say is where there is, like you said, a challenge of some significant magnitude. There has been some impropriety, there has been financial challenges, there has been a series or a succession of leadership issues that just aren't, being able to be resolved. And that's when a board is basically taking a step back and saying, you know what, I think we need to take a breath. We need to pause. We need to think through something more significant. And as we do that, we need somebody to come in to help not only kind of hold the steering wheel, but also help us think strategically about what the future should look like. And then ultimately, with that new strategic vision, identify a new leader that will be there for the long term. right? And so that's the kind of role that, like I was saying, those ones are a little bit longer. Typically, that's a minimum of a 6 month engagement. I would say what I'm usually seeing is that it goes up to about 9 months, maybe even a little longer. If it's much longer than 9 months, you're probably being either one of two things are can be happening. One, you're being considered for the actual CEO role,
Yeah.
and if you want to do that, great. Or number two is that the organization's board and situation is so unclear that it is, it's providing it's getting hard to even identify the path to get a new leader in there for the future, right? But one way or the other, in those engagements, I would say there are two core responsibilities that you have as the interim CEO. And so honestly, those are the ones I like doing because they really fit with my both skill set and interest. One is you've got to keep the wheels on the bus, right? For whatever reason, there's been a challenge, and the organization, presumably, if you're going to do this work, it should be with a group that you admire, respect. Um, they're doing good work, and you want that good work to continue, but somehow it's fraying and you need to get in there pretty quickly and ensure the integrity of what's going on so that that continues, that mission-based effort continues on, right? And it might not be continuing at the highest level, but it's got to be continuing at a level that is reasonable based on the situation that you're in, the transition. And then the second is that then you're looking at, now with that kind of smoothing out of at least the operations, what does the future potentially look like in a new, refreshed engagement? So it almost becomes a strategy consulting project where you're
Mhm.
saying, let's work very heavily with the board, with key stakeholders, executive leadership, donors, others, to say, let's imagine what this organization looks like now that we can all take a break, right? And have a moment. And then you start helping to implement some structural change that helps position the organization to get to that new reality. But even there, then you've got to be mindful that somebody else is going to come in and it's ultimately their responsibility to take it to the next level. So you kind of, using the mountain analogy, you climb up the mountain, but you stop at maybe the first or second Sherpa station, and you hand over your knapsack to the full long term leader, and you cheer them on as they climb up the mountain.
You've been toiling in this work for some time. What would be the tips that you would suggest to a nonprofit that, first of all, has made the decision to have an interim? And maybe we should start there first. Should all organizations look at an interim so that they take that time? I mean, when is the right time to say, yeah, that's what we're going to do?
Yeah, well, that's a fantastic question, Ruth. I mean, I would say, first and foremost, it kind of comes back down to that difference between the two types of engagements I mentioned, right? If you've got somebody in your if your organization is reasonably solid, right? But obviously everybody wants it to do better. But if it's not hemorrhaging, or if it's not kind of in a downward fall, and you've got somebody internally that you feel like could hold the steering wheel fairly well for 2, 3, 4 months while you figure it out, you probably don't need an interim, right? Because that person's going to understand enough and be able to help navigate it. Interim, really, there's got to be a lot of socialization of that person. They've got to learn the ropes. They got to understand the teams. They got to understand everything. And you can announce to the world that you've got somebody else coming in and all of this other stuff. So there's a lot of transition pieces there. So if you don't need to do it, I wouldn't do it. And I say that both as advises clients, but also as a board member myself of a number of different entities. Like, you don't want to go through that hassle. On the other hand, though, if you either do not have somebody that is really well positioned for this work, and or you have, you know, a challenging environment that you do need to take a pause, and in some regards, you would like external eyes to come in and say, let me give you a fuller assessment of the organization's strategic position, the financial position, the team's capabilities, potentially avenues for you to build and grow this, then you would potentially benefit from an interim CEO. And I would say it's not just somebody to clock in and clock out and watch folks and make sure that they're just kind of doing their daily jobs and not goofing off. It's more of a real purposeful engagement with your board to say, and executive leadership to say, hey, what's this look like, if in its better form, right? And let's do that. And then ultimately, they of course can help you with the time-intensive process of identifying a new CEO through a search firm, right? They're not conducting the search, the board drives that search. You do need somebody in leadership to be able to help manage that process and help guide it, to get you that outcome.
So if you've made that decision that you want to go with an interim for whatever reason, what steps or tips do you have for the board? Who or what should, who should they be looking for, and what kind of skills should they possess to make sure that it's a good relationship as they find their more forever leader?
Yeah, that's a great question too. I mean, and maybe I'll start with kind of answering a kind of a tangential piece of your question, which is, I think first and foremost, you need to make sure that particularly your board chair or executive committee is all in, because that interim CEO is going to need guidance and going to need a partner from the board perspective, particularly because oftentimes an interim role involves challenging personnel decisions. If you're doing particularly that second type of engagement, there are structural challenges that are embedded in the organization that need to be addressed and probably addressed reasonably quickly. And so your CEO needs a partner, on the board, partners that can be really helpful. And that's when this really works well. So that's number one. And then number two, then with that in mind, the board, as it's searching for the kind of person, I would say number one is you need somebody with a calm demeanor, somebody that's able to step into crisis and be able to say, you know what, like, yeah, the house may be falling apart or burning down even, but we're going to be a very systematic, thoughtful, deliberate, intentional, and quick, but not creating more stress by virtue of their stress like personality, right? That's just something that's very important in this work. And then number two is somebody that's highly confident in terms of just, I kind of liken the work as like I'm not a pilot in any way. So just to be clear about that, never even tried that. But I was just like, it's like maybe flight simulators, in a game deck or something like that. But it's like you're stepping into a cockpit, and it might look a little different. There might be a different model of the plane, but it's all the same dials with levers, and you begin to you get to feel it pretty quick, right? It's like operations, governance, programs, fundraising, human resources, all of it. Like it's the same elements, and somebody that has enough experience to be able to come in quickly, make that assessment, and then start to drive process pretty quick in a calm manner. I think that's what you really are looking for.
How does an organization go about finding interim CEOs? I mean, is there interim CEO association or some other outlet?
Not to my knowledge. I mean, I think there are some firms out there that are like explicitly interim CEO, temporary staffing, those types of things. Typically what I find is people reach out to executive search firms. And so they're not be looking at the CEO right away. Ultimately, they will be, but they're saying, hey, in the interim, do you know somebody? And so those firms can kind of like, they sometimes keep some stables of folks out there that they know. Oftentimes it's a word of mouth game, though. It's like, hey, so and so, I think they had challenges. They had an interim CEO come in. Was that person available? Maybe they interviewed some folks that and typically in a town, town like Kansas City, there's going to be 4 or 5 people that are sort of regularly kind of like thought of when this comes up. And then it's a question of whether they're the right fit, whether they're available. But yeah, there's no easy way of identifying, at least not for me. And hopefully people watch podcasts where there's an opportunity to learn about.
What kind of tips would you have for somebody who steps into an interim role, whether it's an outside hire or, as you say, a leader stepping up within the organization, but not necessarily being considered for the permanent top leader?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first step is to be a very good listener, right? And not just to be appearing as a good listener because you need to, but also actually being highly attuned to what you're hearing from people so that you can use that as you are then ultimately making decisions, right? And this is, to be honest, this isn't terribly different than what I would say for any CEO. I mean, I coach CEOs regularly, but in the interim role, it's particularly important because what I often think of is that as you come into an organization, particularly one that's in a challenging position, there are lots of varying perspectives on what the challenge is. There's lots of different personalities that have created ripple effects over the course of time. Lots of people want to be heard. And what you need to do is, essentially create your own understanding of what the baseline challenge, needs, and pathway forward is. But I almost liken it to like, you're building a mosaic and you're picking up pebbles all along the way, right? And you're just saying, okay, pebble here. And then you're kind of creating that, that representation of what actually this organism is, what is it, what is it that's happening and where the needs are. And so I would say listening is critically important. And then I would say, secondly, like when you come to some conclusion about what are the things you need to do, make sure you're tightly aligned with the board, and particularly that executive, whether it be board chair or executive committee, because you're going to need their back, right? Like the last thing you need their backing. They have your back, right? And what ends up happening is that because then you're going to need to articulate with clarity and decisiveness. Here's what the first steps in this path look like, and here's what the path looks like, right? And you absolutely need confidence in that decision making and that articulation if you're going to do that. So those are the types of things that I think are part of the beginning of the journey here.
If you're serving as an interim CEO, or this is something you're considering as part of a career move, is it okay to have that expectation and that you could get the job, or how do you balance that?
Yeah. I mean, it's an interesting conversation. I mean, I think, typically, I guess I would say you really want to kind of just be very clear about where your mind is from the very beginning, right? And that's both on the board side as well as then the candidate side, right? So for me, as a general matter, I'm not a general. For me, here's good demonstration of clarity. I shouldn't say as a general. For me, I am not interested in a permanent role at this point in my career, right? And if I am interested, I'm going to be very purposeful about applying for it in that construct. So when I come in with an interim, I say very clearly, this is the time frame I expect. It could potentially extend based on, the needs of the organization. I'm never going to leave an organization in the lurch, right? But this is our general parameters. I am not interested in the CEO role, permanent role. And then what ends up happening is that, and this has happened at times, you do receive inquiries. Hey, you're doing such a great job. Are you willing to take it on for the future? And I nip that in the bud very quickly and say, as much as I love this organization and I love the work you're doing, I'm not your guy for the long term. And let's make sure you get somebody that really is passionate about this and wants to do it with you. Because you just don't want to leave that. There's too many variables in this mix that are unclear and challenging. Take the ones that you can make clear and make them clear. That's what.
So it sounds like you want a calm individual. You also want to vet whoever you're asking to come in as an interim and making sure you're getting the right person.
Of course.
And then make it clear that maybe you're not looking for that job, or you are. Either way, to make it very, very clear.
Yeah, it could be. And if you were interested, just to say, you could say that. You could say, but listen, I understand it's almost a try before you buy sort of frame. Like, okay, we're doing it for 6 months, and if it works on both sides, not just me, but you too, like maybe we'll do it, right? And if not, but let's have a deliberate conversation at a certain amount of time to make that happen.
Awais, this has been great advice for folks who are looking for interims, folks who want to be interims, etc. We appreciate your time and your expertise.
Oh, this has been so fun. It really has. I so appreciate the conversation, the dialogue, the thoughtfulness, and kind of the work you're doing overall. It's just so important to kind of spread, whether it be this kind of knowledge, but other areas too, to our community. So really appreciate it.
And thank you for joining us for KC Cares, Kansas City's nonprofit voice. We're produced by a nonprofit called Charitable Communications. And this segment was brought to you by the Ewing, Marion Kaufman Foundation, www.kaufman.org. Now, if you'd like to be a guest on our podcast, check out our website, kccaresonline.org. And you can spread the love. We're on Facebook and Twitter at KC Cares Radio and on Instagram at KC Cares Online. Don't forget, you can catch us Saturday mornings at 8 a.m. on ESPN 1510 AM and 94.5 FM. Thanks for joining us on KC Cares.